This book summary is for A Troublesome Inheritance: Genes, Race, and Human History. The core idea of this book is human evolution has never stopped. It has not only created differences among races, but has also influenced the development of social systems and even altered the course of human civilization and history. When you think of evolution, the classic image of an ape evolving into a human might come to mind. But how could evolution be connected to grand concepts like social systems and the course of history? Let's start with an analogy. Modern research shows that our true human ancestors appeared in Africa about 200,000 years ago. If we condense this vast period into 1 hour, for the first 45 minutes, human activity was confined to a small tribe in Africa. It was only in the last 15 minutes that they began migrating to other continents. The development of agriculture and settled life happened in the final 5 minutes. The birth of nations and all of subsequent history took up less than a minute and a half. This analogy illustrates that on the scale of biological evolution, the time since human lineages separated is actually very short. As a result, the genes of all humanity are highly similar, with precise measurements showing a maximum difference of no more than 8%. But this raises a question. If the genetic differences are so small, why is there such a vast disparity in the civilizational achievements of different peoples? The answer this book provides is that these seemingly minor genetic differences are enough to shape significant distinctions in intelligence, temperament, and social abilities. The level of achievement a race can attain depends to some extent on its genetic makeup. The author even posits the bold idea that the transitions of social systems and the changes in modern history have been influenced, to varying degrees, by the uncontrollable force of genetic evolution. This view carries a rather fatalistic tone, which is perhaps the deeper meaning behind the book's title, A Troublesome Inheritance. Because this topic is highly sensitive and easily labeled as racist, countless books have been written about biological evolution, yet few have dared to directly apply evolutionary concepts to the issue of race. Most authors either avoid the topic or gloss over it. However, the author of this book bravely ventures into this scientific minefield. He not only provides a deep analysis of race from an evolutionary perspective, but also deconstructs the intrinsic links between evolution, social systems, and historical phenomena, offering a highly thought-provoking read. This outspoken author is a giant in the scientific community, Nicholas Wade. He has served as deputy editor of the top science journal Nature, a reporter for Science magazine, and an editor and reporter for the New York Times. Wade is passionate about the study of human evolution and has published a trilogy of books on the subject, of which A Troublesome Inheritance is one. The other two are Before the Dawn and The Faith Instinct. So, how exactly does the author build his case? The book progressively explores 3 key points. The first key point revolves around a central question. Besides external traits like skin color and hair, has evolution caused internal differences among races? The second key point explores the relationship between human evolution and social systems. The author argues that although the evolution of social systems is mainly influenced by culture, evolution has also played a significant role. The third key point explains why the world-changing Industrial Revolution erupted in 18th century Europe and how this, too, is closely linked to human evolution. Let's begin with the first point. Has human evolution caused internal differences among races? According to our opening analogy, the separation of human lineages is recent, and our genes are highly similar, so racial differences should be minimal. But let me ask you another question. Are humans still evolving today? According to Darwin's theory of evolution, species filter genes through heredity under the pressure of natural selection. If an individual develops a mutation that is better adapted to the environment, its offspring will have a better chance of survival and reproduction. Unless a species goes extinct, evolution never stops. As a type of biological organism, humans, in theory, should also be continuously evolving. This point may seem uncontroversial, yet there is a view in academia today that human evolution stopped thousands of years ago. This perspective holds that while the major human races differ in biological traits like skin color and hair, these differences became fixed before the dawn of civilization. Moreover, a few thousand years is but a fleeting moment on the evolutionary timescale. Therefore, differences in behavior and customs among races are attributed entirely to cultural variations. But the author points out that this view is a form of self-deception that violates the scientific spirit. The reason scholars are reluctant to admit that evolution is ongoing is that biological evolution is necessarily regional. Acknowledging that human evolution continues is tantamount to admitting that different peoples have evolved to different degrees, a conclusion that is highly controversial. This is because racists throughout history have sought so-called scientific justification for the idea of racial superiority, claiming that evolutionarily superior races have a natural right to rule, while those with inferior genes have no right to exist. Before World War II, over 70,000 people with hereditary diseases in Europe were executed during the war. More than 6 million Jews were systematically murdered by the Nazis. To this day, ethnic conflicts remain acute in some countries. Therefore, establishing the concept of race on a scientific level carries the risk of being exploited by demagogues to incite racism. However, scientific research clearly shows that human evolution has never ceased, and it can proceed rapidly. The author cites the example of African Americans, whose ancestors arrived in the Americas in the 16th century. After just a few generations, their genes began adapting to the new environment. For instance, a gene mutation that confers resistance to malaria, once common among Africans, has a decreasing frequency in today's African American population because the selective pressure of malaria is absent in the United States. Conversely, the frequency of gene mutations that resist influenza has increased. This clearly indicates that natural selection has continued to operate in recent centuries and that the evolution of African Americans has not stopped. Furthermore, evolution has indeed shown strong regional characteristics. A team at Stanford University using DNA microarray technology found that over 90% of Europeans have ancestors who lived within a 435-mile radius. This means that, historically, gene flow was very limited. Geographically distant populations accumulated different genetic mutations over time. Mutations beneficial for survival gradually increased in frequency, and over long periods, the characteristic differences between populations became more pronounced. For example, the enzyme that breaks down lactose in most of us disappears after we are weaned. This is because, in agricultural societies, infants rarely consumed dairy after buruchi. But 5,000 years ago, a cattle-herding nomadic civilization emerged in Central Europe, where people regularly drank raw milk. For them, the ability to absorb the lactose in milk was a huge survival advantage. Consequently, through natural selection, almost all Dutch and Swedish people today can break down lactose. Studies also show that the farther a population is from the center of this nomadic culture, the lower the proportion of this gene mutation. There is also a finding we may be most reluctant to face. Evolution has influenced the intellectual development of different peoples, with the most striking example being the Jewish people. Though small in population, this group has produced countless Nobel laureates and brilliant minds. IQ tests show that Ashkenazi Jews have the highest average IQ in the world, with 23 out of every 1,000 people having an IQ of 140 or above, 6 times the global average. Research has found a series of unique mutations in their genes that allow for richer neural connections, though these can also lead to certain genetic diseases, a finding that aligns closely with the physiological traits of the Jewish people. Why is the IQ of Ashkenazi Jews so much higher than that of the local European populations? A research team discovered that after the Jewish diaspora in Europe, they were widely discriminated against and excluded from the upper echelons of society, leading them to specialize in trade and finance. In ancient times, commercial activities like calculating interest and drafting contracts demanded high levels of computational and logical thinking skills. This created strong evolutionary pressure on the Jewish people. At a time when 90% of Europeans were illiterate, nearly every Jewish person could read and write. Meanwhile, Jewish religious law strictly forbade intermarriage with outsiders, causing genes associated with high intelligence to become concentrated within the group at a rapid pace. Through generations of this selection, Jews with lower intelligence or an aversion to study were weeded out by society. In just about 500 years or 20 generations, the average IQ of Ashkenazi Jews rose to be 16 points higher than that of the local Europeans. However, the author repeatedly emphasizes that while genes have an influence on a race's achievements, they are far from being the decisive factor. Even if one race is proven to be smarter than another, What does that really mean? Jewish society was not more advanced than European society, and its civilizational influence was far smaller. On the contrary, the more comprehensively we study human evolution, the more we find that advantageous and disadvantageous genes always coexist. No single race possesses a so-called absolute evolutionary advantage in all environments. Therefore, studying evolutionary differences between races does not fuel racism, rather, it helps to dismantle the pseudo-scientific foundations of racism. Returning to the question of this section, did evolution create internal differences among races? The author's answer is yes. From a genetic perspective, humans have not only been continuously evolving, but have also shown racial differences. These differences stem not only from the natural environment but also from the social environments we inhabit, and this is the key distinction between human and animal evolution. If society can drive evolution, can evolution, in turn, influence the form of society? This brings us to the book's second key point. Heredity and evolution affect the development of social systems. Some say a country's pace of development depends on the quality of its institutions. We typically consider social systems to be within the realm of the humanities, reflecting human social attributes, with no connection to biological attributes like genetic evolution. But the author rejects this view, arguing that human heredity and evolution encompass social as well as biological attributes, and that genes, to some extent, have influenced the evolution of social systems. At its core, the root of all social systems is humanity's instinctive social behavior. From simple barter to complex financial contracts, the starting point is the human instinct for exchange and mutual benefit. But a historical comparison reveals that our instinctive social behaviors have changed dramatically from those of our ancestors, and these changes correspond to the development of social systems. The author summarizes three key changes. The first change is a reduction in violent tendencies. The more advanced a society, the more people need to coexist peacefully to produce and live together, rather than being aggressive and combative. Over the past 200,000 years, human society has moved through hunter-gatherer, tribal, feudal, and modern stages. Throughout this process, the violent instincts of humans as a species have continuously weakened. Compared to primitive humans, modern humans have more slender skeletons and smaller jaws, so small, in fact, that they often cannot accommodate all our teeth, which is why many people need to have their wisdom teeth removed. Anthropologists believe we lost our ancestors' robust skeletons and powerful jaws because violence no longer conferred a survival advantage. The belligerent were either executed or exiled, while those skilled at cooperation were more likely to prosper and leave more offspring. Data shows that the homicide rate for Englishmen dropped from 0.3% in the 12th century to 0.1% in the 16th century, and further to 0.01% by the 18th century. In some primitive tribes, like the Ache of Paraguay, this rate is as high as 0.5%. At the genetic level, scientists have identified a gene associated with violence, which is responsible for clearing excess neurotransmitters. When this gene is abnormal, the accumulated neurotransmitters can disrupt neurons, making a person irritable and prone to anger. Studies have found this gene abnormality in 5% of Black Americans, compared to only 0.1% of white Americans. However, the author cautiously adds that this research is still in its early stages, and there is more than one gene controlling violent behavior, so one cannot declare a race more violent based on a single gene. The second change is an enhanced sense of cooperation. The more advanced a society, the stronger its people's cooperative spirit. Early primitive humans were like animals, killing each other over food with no concept of cooperation. In hunter-gatherer societies, activities like hunting large animals and defending territory made cooperation essential. This societal form lasted for 185,000 years. It wasn't until 15,000 years ago, when humans began to settle down into tribal societies, that agricultural production, religious activities, and warfare demanded even closer cooperation. In modern times, laws and moral codes guide people to become part of a collective effort to achieve common goals, which requires a powerful cooperative spirit. Research shows that a 1.5-year-old toddler, upon seeing an unfamiliar adult struggling to open a door with their hands full, will spontaneously try to help. A 1-year-old infant who sees an adult lose an object knows to point it out. This awareness is clearly not learned but can only be explained by heredity, indicating that humans are born with a desire to integrate into a group and use collective power to achieve goals. When we are not accepted by those around us, we instinctively feel embarrassed and blush. Therefore, cooperating with others has been internalized as part of our nature, and the more developed a society is, the stronger its people's cooperative sense. The third change is an expanded radius of trust. As society progresses, people's scope of trust in strangers widens. Medical researchers have found that a neurohormone in the body called oxytocin enhances trust between people, earning it the nickname, the trust hormone. This suggests that our level of trust in others is not determined solely by life experience but is also related to our hormone levels. Interestingly, the more advanced a society, the wider its people's radius of trust. The author believes this must be linked to the genes that control oxytocin in our bodies. In hunter-gatherer societies, people trusted only family and were hostile to outsiders. In tribal societies, the trust radius expanded to one's own tribe. Tribes were bound by kinship, and members could only turn to their tribe for help. In contrast, people in modern societies are more willing to interact with strangers, allowing them to work and live within a much broader scope. These countries often transitioned out of tribal societies and into a feudal era long ago. The author uses China as an example. From the Bampo culture in the Yellow River Basin to the unification by the Qin dynasty in 221 BC, China's tribal society lasted for at least 7,000 years. The Qin dynasty, through its system of prefectures and counties, established a centralized, unified state, gradually pushing the aristocracies of the former 6 states and the tribal clan powers they represented off the historical stage. In the subsequent 2 millennia of evolution, the Chinese people gradually shed the constraints of tribalism on interpersonal relations at a genetic level. This is why, in the last half-century, the Chinese have been able to rapidly adapt to modern social systems and develop a prosperous economy and culture. In contrast, Africa's path to modernization has been exceptionally difficult. Most African nations remain impoverished today. Even with abundant natural resources and massive annual international aid, their development stagnates. Some blame the legacy of colonialism, but the author argues that Europeans withdrew from Africa over half a century ago. In that same period, China underwent a monumental transformation, while African nations have remained poor and underdeveloped. The author contends that the root cause of their poverty is the lack of inclusive social institutions required by a modern state, which is likely related to Africans' smaller radius of trust. Historically, Africa remained in a tribal stage for a long time and never entered a feudal era. For them, anyone outside the tribe is untrustworthy. Children are taught from a young age that my tribe is always right, and the chief is more reliable than the national president. Consequently, even if such a child becomes a government official later in life, they will prioritize using their power for personal gain and to benefit their own family and tribe. This leads to widespread power monopolies and political corruption, much like the feudal states of China's spring and autumn period. Since the radius of trust is linked to genetics, it is difficult to change over the course of just a few generations. Of course, compared to the immense driving force of culture, the influence of genes on institutional evolution is much smaller. A baby born in an African tribe but raised in a modern society can become a modern person entirely through learning innate genes would not pose a major obstacle. But when this small genetic influence is applied to an entire people, its effect is magnified. Therefore, while an individual African can successfully integrate into modernity through cultural influence, a backward African ethnic group would find it very difficult to successfully transplant an advanced social system. The deciding factor here is likely the genes that control violence, cooperation, and the radius of trust. To summarize this section, according to the author, the evolution of social systems is influenced not only by culture, the decisive factor, but also by changes in innate human behaviors. A gradual mellowing of temperament, an increasingly strong cooperative spirit, and an expanding radius of trust have fundamentally changed humanity, in turn driving the transformation of social systems. In this process, the transition from tribal to feudal society was particularly crucial. The author notes that, historically, only ancient Europeans and the Chinese relatively completed this transition, forming powerful empires and continuous civilizations that laid the groundwork for more profound social changes to come. This more profound change was the first industrial revolution, which brought humanity into the modern era. Why did it happen specifically in 18th century Europe? Academia offers many theories. The institutional change theory suggests that England's burgeoning democracy, market competition, and patent system sparked the revolution. The Enlightenment theory posits that scientific and technological development, along with accessible financing, paved the way. But no theory has ever linked the Industrial Revolution to population evolution. This is the final key point we will discuss: the genetic secret behind the Industrial Revolution. The author proposes a novel idea. The Industrial Revolution's occurrence in the modern era was not an accident but the product of humanity evolving to a specific stage. He believes that for a country to enter an industrial society, it must first complete two transformations. First, its social system must upgrade from a tribal to a feudal society. This is beyond doubt. Second, its people must be able to overcome the innate human instincts of violence, short-sightedness, and impulsiveness to become qualified workers. How is this standard met? Through evolution, the author argues. And human evolution is an extremely long process that spanned the 2 millennia of feudal society preceding the Industrial Revolution. The author believes the pressure driving the evolution of workers came from hunger. It is hard for us to imagine today, but historically, even the relatively wealthy Europeans and Chinese struggled on the brink of subsistence. Even in prosperous dynasties, the vast majority of people, aside from a tiny aristocracy, did not have enough to eat. In the late 17th century, an English cleric named Malthus discovered a pattern. After a good harvest, more children would be born. This larger population would then consume more food. By the next generation, everyone would be back to a state of scarcity, no better off than their ancestors. The population, which had grown precariously due to a temporary abundance of food, would then decline again. This endless cycle is the famous Malthusian Trap. Within the Malthusian Trap, the pressure on individuals to survive was immense. Even a slight advantage over the average person could make someone wealthier, allowing them to raise more children and even join the upper class. The offspring of the rich would gradually replace the children of the poor, and the genes that helped accumulate wealth would be passed down. This was especially true in ancient China, where a person of humble birth, if intelligent and hardworking, could change their fate by accumulating wealth. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, 1/3 of the highest-ranking officials came from commoner backgrounds. These exceptional individuals could rise from the bottom to the top of society overnight, holding high office and enjoying great wealth, leaving behind more offspring. But the capacity of the upper class was limited, and most of their descendants would, for various reasons, return to the lower strata of society, bringing the superior genes of the upper class with them. After dozens of generations in this cycle, the behavior patterns of later farmers were drastically different from those of their ancestors. One could say they had evolved the essential qualities of a competent workforce required for the Industrial Revolution. What were these qualities? The author identifies 3. First, a reduction in violence. As mentioned earlier, human temperament has continuously mellowed through evolution. In the 20th century, despite 2 world wars, the human death rate from war reached a historical low. 2,000 years ago, this death rate was 5 times higher than it is today. Second, an enhanced ability to learn. In the 2 centuries from the 16th to the 18th century, the illiteracy rate for English men dropped from 70% to 40%. Similar to the case of the Jewish people, this declining illiteracy rate indicates that more and more people were being freed from the land to engage in commerce or handicrafts. Finally, and most importantly, the habit of delayed gratification. This is a psychological concept that refers to foregoing immediate pleasure for a greater long-term reward, what we often call work hard now, enjoy the rewards later. Psychologists conducted the famous marshmallow experiment. A group of children were given a choice between 1 marshmallow now or 2 if they waited 15 minutes. Follow-up studies found that the children who chose to wait generally had better test scores and stronger social skills as adults. The author believes that delayed gratification actually goes against our animal instincts and that humans could only acquire this trait through a long period of evolution. For example, in 14th century England, The interest rate on loans was around 10%, essentially usurious. But by the 18th century, the rate had fallen to 3%. The author argues this shows that the English people had become more patient, less prone to profligate spending, and more willing to save, which in turn made it easier for them to become wealthy. Thus, after more than a millennium of the brutal ordeal of the Malthusian Trap, the English people gradually evolved from coarse peasants into a modern workforce. You might ask, Chinese peasants also went through this entire process and should have had the genetic prerequisites for an industrial revolution, so why didn't it first erupt in China? The author offers two explanations. First, the geopolitical environment. After the 10th century, the core region of European civilization was never threatened by a major external invasion again. As a result, Europeans had no urgent need for a unified empire. The various small states, in their relatively independent competition and development, much like China's Warring States period, gradually fostered a renaissance of science and culture. In contrast, Chinese civilization constantly faced the threat of northern nomadic peoples, requiring a strong, centralized empire to ensure its survival. The negative consequence of this was oppressive, authoritarian rule. Anyone who challenged authority or proposed innovative ideas was likely to be eliminated by the emperor. This created a stifling environment for academic development, ultimately causing China to fall behind the West in science and technology. Second, social behavior. In the Malthusian Trap, the primary path to the upper class for Europeans was through commerce, trade, and overseas exploration. Through this class mobility, genes for risk-taking and innovation became more common. In feudal China, however, agriculture was favored while commerce was suppressed. The main channel to the upper class was excelling in study leads to an official career, which meant passing the imperial civil service examinations. This system, with its rigid, stylized essays, selected for individuals with good memories, high intelligence, and loyalty to the emperor. Over generations of this inheritance, the entire society became increasingly conservative, leaving little room for the development of science and technology and sadly missing the opportunity to enter the modern era. And that brings us to the end of our discussion. Let's briefly review the main points. First, we discussed the issue of human evolution. The author points out that in the last few thousand years, human evolution has been ongoing, and genetic differences do exist between different peoples. However, this is not an endorsement of racism. There is no superiority or inferiority among human races, and scientific findings should not be distorted by political views. Next, we explored the relationship between genetics and social systems. The author argues that in order to adapt to selective pressures, humans have continuously refined their genes, which in turn has changed their instinctive social behaviors. This change, to some extent, has promoted the evolution of social systems. Finally, we decoded the genetic secret behind the Industrial Revolution. The author suggests that a key reason the Industrial Revolution began in modern Europe is that the agricultural populations of Europe and China, after enduring the long ordeal of the Malthusian Trap, underwent a qualitative change in their genes, laying the biological foundation for the birth of the Industrial Revolution. However, it was Europe's more open and diverse institutions that ultimately led to the rise of the modern West. This has been a summary of the main content of A Troublesome Inheritance. I would like to add a final note that the book's points about how evolution has changed human genes and its impact on social behavior are supported by research data. However, the comparisons of social system evolution and the genetic perspective on the Industrial Revolution are more the author's own interpretations. We can follow the author's line of thought to imagine a little about the future of humanity. As communication and exchange among the world's peoples deepen, barriers will inevitably diminish, and evolutionary pressures will become more uniform. Perhaps in the distant future, the global community we dream of could truly become a reality. Congratulations, you've just finished another book.